Some clues are carved in stone. Others are hidden in the most delicate of places. One autumn evening, an unremarkable feather was brought to Baker Street. Soft, white, weightless, nothing unusual at first glance. But when Holmes examined it under the lamplight, something unexpected glimmered inside its shaft. A tiny, perfectly shaped key concealed within the feather itself. And more importantly, what door did this impossible key unlock? Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth in today's case. Holmes uncovers a secret tucked inside the lightest of objects, and the trail it leads to is anything but fragile. Stay with me till the end, because the truth behind this hidden key isn't just clever, it's astonishing. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a mystery. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see detectives from around the world join the hunt. So, pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second until the very end. Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was in the late autumn of 1891 that the affair of the feather first stirred the foggy stillness of Baker Street, setting Holmes once again in motion after a long and wearying silence. I remember the morning distinctly, for the skies hung low with a leaden gray, and a biting wind stirred the curled leaves along the pavement like fragments of forgotten paper. The fire crackled in our grate, and Holmes sat, long legs drawn up beneath him on the settee, a violin balanced idly across his knee. There had been no case for a fortnight, and it showed. His pipe had been employed more for distraction than pleasure, and the stack of monographs on obscure poisons and tropical insects remained untouched, which in Holmes's world was as good as a cry for help. I, for my part, had taken to studying the recent dispatches in the Times, where word of a peculiar incident at Ashcroft House had begun to appear in the more speculative columns. "Watson," said Holmes suddenly, "what do you make of the matter of the dead ornithologist?" I looked up from the newspaper. "You mean the fellow found in his study with a goose feather jammed into the keyhole?" Holmes gave the faintest smirk and nodded. "An intriguing detail, is it not? A locked room, a dead man, and a single feather in the door. No sign of forced entry, no key. And the man himself?" I asked, placing the paper down. "Professor Horace Ellery," Holmes said, drawing a slip of paper from the pocket of his dressing gown. "A leading authority on avian behavior, especially migratory patterns in northern waterfowl, unmarried, no staff, found by his housekeeper, who arrived late after falling ill the day before." "How did he die?" "Ah," said Holmes, rising, "that, Watson, is the beginning of our journey. The cause of death was initially thought to be heart failure. Yet the local police, though rarely imaginative, found the positioning of the corpse too deliberate. He was slumped at his writing desk, pen still in hand, and with his face turned precisely toward the door as though expecting a visitor." Holmes stepped to the window and flicked aside the curtain. "But it is the feather that interests me. A common goose feather, yet inserted into the keyhole from the inside. The key, naturally, is nowhere to be found." I read it twice over, I admitted. "It's quite baffling." "Indeed," said Holmes. "Which is precisely why I have just received this telegram from Inspector Lestrade." He handed it to me, and I read, come at once. Situation beyond our grasp. Locked room, vanished key and feather. Lestrade, I take it we shall be leaving shortly? I asked. Holmes had already opened his wardrobe. Ashcroft House is in Wandsworth. A short cab ride and a welcome distraction. Within the hour, we found ourselves in Lestrade's company, standing within the narrow corridor of Ashcroft's house. Wrought iron railings and a door knocker shaped like a raptor's talon. The house seemed subdued, as though holding its breath. Lestrade greeted us with his usual mixture of relief and thinly veiled irritation. Thank you for coming, Mr. Holmes. This one's beyond my usual cases. No sign of forced entry, no windows disturbed. The housekeeper swears she locked the door behind her yesterday evening when she left. And the feather? Holmes asked, already stepping inside. Lestrade led us to the study. It was a narrow chamber, lined with glass-fronted cabinets of preserved bird specimens and weathered notebooks. The body of Professor Ellery had already been removed, but the chair remained pulled out at a perfect angle. A blot of ink marked the parchment on the desk, where a single, unfinished sentence read, "It comes with wings, but nothing more." Holmes leaned down toward the door. This is the one. Lestrade nodded. We pulled the feather out to test the lock. It's an ordinary quill. No blood, no message. We've searched every inch of this room. The key is gone. Holmes knelt, examining the keyhole with his glass. Remarkable, he muttered. I turned toward the desk, noticing that one glass case had been smashed to fragments, swept neatly to the corner. Was this done during the incident? No signs of struggle, Lestrade said. Odd, isn't it? If someone broke in and murdered the professor, why smash only that case and take nothing? Holmes had risen and was now inspecting the rug, lifting its corner. Watson, observe. The faintest scuff mark, here, angled inward. Someone knelt or fell right here, before the desk. But there's no trace of a key, I said. And why would someone insert a feather into the lock from the inside? Unless, exactly, Holmes replied, eyes glinting. Unless the culprit wanted us to think the door had never been opened. A feather is not a key, but it plays its part. We stayed the better part of the afternoon, combing through papers, interrogating the shaken housekeeper, and retracing every movement from the previous day. Holmes asked curious questions about the professor's recent visitors and correspondence, but made no conclusions. As we stepped into the gathering dusk, Holmes paused at the gate. Watson, he said thoughtfully, a man was murdered in silence, in a room sealed not by force, but by symbolism. A key removed, and in its place a message. What kind of message? I asked. Holmes looked skyward, where a cluster of birds wheeled in the gray. One only a bird would understand. Chapter 2. The arrival at Baker Street. We returned to Baker Street beneath a sky the color of worn pewter, the wind biting more sharply than before. Holmes was unusually silent during our cab ride, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin and his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the soot-streaked rooftops of London. I had come to recognize that expression, mixture of inward excitement and calculated restraint. It was as if the machinery of his mind had already begun to whir, though he had not yet chosen to share its workings. Holmes, I ventured, as we turned onto Marylebone Road, do you truly believe this was murder? He blinked once and turned his head toward me. There is little doubt, Watson. Though I confess, it is not the act of murder that fascinates me, but the manner of its concealment. I frowned. The feather in the keyhole. Precisely. You see, a door that is locked from within suggests suicide or accident, but the insertion of a feather into the keyhole, an utterly useless gesture from a practical standpoint, makes it theatrical. The act of someone who understands psychology and wishes to mislead. The cab pulled to a stop, and we disembarked. As we entered our lodgings, Mrs. Hudson met us at the stair, her brow furrowed. "Mr. Holmes, a gentleman has called twice in your absence. Left no name, only said he'd return this evening. Rather urgent," he said. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Did he give any description?" "He wore a brown overcoat and a flat cap," she replied. "Spoke like he was from the north, maybe Yorkshire. Polite, but his hands were trembling." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. That will be all." Once inside, Holmes went directly to his desk and lit the lamp. He removed the feather he had pocketed at Ashcroft House and laid it flat on a clean white cloth. I watched as he examined the quill with his lens, then extracted a slender scalpel and made a precise incision along its shaft. Embedded just below the surface was a thin metallic wire. "Good heavens," I murmured. "It's not a quill at all." "Indeed it is not," Holmes replied. "At least, not in the traditional sense. Someone has hollowed it and reinforced it with steel, likely to ensure it held its form when inserted into the lock." "But what purpose would that serve?" I asked, baffled. "That," Holmes murmured, "is precisely the question." He turned the feather in his fingers, holding it up to the light. "You see, Watson, we are dealing with a mind that delights in symbols. A feather, typically light and ephemeral, has been turned into a tool of suggestion." Just then, the bell rang sharply. Holmes snapped his gaze toward the door. Our visitor, no doubt. I rose to answer it, and returned with a man of uncertain age, perhaps 40, though prematurely lined. He removed his cap and wrung it nervously in his hands. His overcoat was stained near the hem, and his boots bore the dry-caked dust of country roads. "Mr. Holmes," he said hoarsely, I've come because I heard what happened to Professor Ellery, and I think I'm next." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "Begin at once, Mr. Jarvis, Edmund Jarvis. I was Professor Ellery's assistant for nearly 5 years." Holmes folded his hands. "Go on." I helped catalog specimens, organize lectures, tend to the birds he kept for study. He trusted me. "Did you quarrel recently?" Jarvis looked horrified. "No, sir, not once. But he'd been unsettled these past weeks. Twitchy. He started sleeping in the study, locking the doors and windows obsessively. Claimed someone was watching the house." "What sort of someone?" Jarvis hesitated. "He never said, but he kept looking up at the skies. I mean, whenever birds passed overhead, he'd pause mid-sentence. Sometimes he'd scribble strange notes in a separate ledger. One I never saw." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Was this ledger found at the scene?" Jarvis shook his head. "No, sir. I asked Inspector Lestrade myself." Holmes stood and paced slowly. "Mr. Jarvis, did Professor Ellery receive any unusual post in the days before his death?" Jarvis nodded hesitantly. "A parcel came last Thursday, wrapped in brown paper. He took it into the study and bolted the door. I didn't see what was in it, But when I cleaned the fireplace the next morning, I found bits of scorched parchment and burnt black at the ends. Holmes came to a stop. And you believe you're in danger. Why? Jarvis looked down at his hands. Because this morning, someone left a feather on the windowsill of my boarding house room. A real one this time, not altered, placed deliberately. It wasn't there when I left to fetch my breakfast roll. Watson and I exchanged a glance. Holmes turned to the fire and stared into the flames. Tell me, Mr. Jarvis was the professor working on anything of note? Any recent discoveries? He'd become obsessed with migration patterns. But he said it wasn't about the birds anymore. Said they were only messengers. I thought it was just his nerves. Holmes turned suddenly. Mr. Jarvis, you are not to return home tonight. You will sleep in a room at the Northumberland Hotel under a false name. I will arrange it. Jarvis paled. You think I'm truly in danger? I think, said Holmes grimly, that your employer was murdered for something he learned, and whoever did it is not yet done. As Jarvis departed under Holmes' instructions, I turned to him once the door had closed. Holmes, you mean to say this is larger than a personal vendetta? Watson, Holmes said quietly, a man was found dead with a feather in a lock. A second man is being warned with one. A journal has vanished. And birds, Watson seemed to hold some part of the answer. He reached for his violin, placing it beneath his chin. I fear, he murmured. We have not yet begun to understand the true shape of the mystery. Chapter 3. A scene of deception. The next morning dawned clear and sharp, with the rooftops of Baker Street glinting faintly with frost. I had scarcely finished my tea when Holmes emerged from his room, already dressed in his gray overcoat and with his walking stick in hand. There was a light in his eyes, cool, analytical, and entirely awake. Come, Watson, he said, fastening his gloves. We must return to Ashcroft House. I have asked Lestrade to grant us another private inspection of the study. There is, I believe, a detail that has been overlooked, perhaps by everyone but the murderer. We took a hansom to Wandsworth, the horse's hooves striking sharp notes on the cobblestones. Holmes said little during the journey, his gaze distant once more. But when we arrived at the house, his energy quickened. Inspector Lestrade met us at the front gate with a skeptical expression. You won't find anything we've missed. Mr. Holmes, he said, leading us inside. We've scoured the place, every drawer and drawer bottom. The housekeeper's been re-interviewed, and I've questioned the neighbors. Not a soul saw anything. I never rely on what others fail to see, Holmes replied mildly. If you'll permit me, I would like the room undisturbed for 1 hour, Lestrade grunted. I'll be in the parlor. Don't knock anything over. The study was just as we had left it, cold, dim, and strangely untouched by time, though a man had died here only days before. Holmes moved at once to the desk, where the blotter and inkwell remained. He examined the partially written note once more. It comes with wings, but an unfinished sentence, Holmes mused. Either he was interrupted, or he thought it complete. He turned his attention to the smashed display case in the corner, the only object in the room to have suffered violence. It had held, I now saw, a stuffed kingfisher, the vibrant blue feathers still visible among the scattered glass. The case had been tilted inward, as though struck with precision, not frenzy. Watson, he said, you remember Mr. Jarvis said nothing was taken. Yes. But something was, Holmes muttered, lifting a shard of the glass with his handkerchief. Not the bird itself, but something that had been placed with it. A note, perhaps. Holmes did not answer. Instead, he turned to the bookshelves and began examining the rows of neatly ordered volumes. He touched each spine, his fingers delicate and exacting, like a pianist searching for a misplaced chord. Suddenly, he stopped. A small monograph, The Northern Flight of the Bar-tailed Godwit, was protruding ever so slightly farther than the rest. Holmes removed it and opened it midway. Inserted between pages was a folded slip of paper. He handed it to me, wordlessly. It was a telegram dated 4 days prior to H. Ellery message, confirmed. Observation aligns with Bremen cipher. Await instructions. Destroy this note, Bremen cipher, I said aloud. Is that a code? Holmes nodded slowly. And not one known in the ordinary circles of correspondence. This is not mere academia, Watson. This begins to suggest espionage, or, at the very least, an encoded message network disguised beneath the trappings of science. But why through ornithology? Because, Holmes said, eyes lighting, it is the perfect cover. Who would suspect messages carried in birding journals, bird specimens, or even via birds themselves? I stared at him. Do you mean carrier pigeons? Not necessarily, but something close. A naturalist with access to migratory species, well-versed in geography and field codes. Why, Watson, the sky becomes a silent postal system if one knows where to look. Holmes turned back to the smashed case. This destruction was not to steal something of value, but to erase a piece of evidence, perhaps even a micro-coded tag hidden within the plumage. He crossed quickly to the hearth, where the ashes from the previous fire remained undisturbed. Taking a poker, he stirred the remains gently. Fragments of burned parchment appeared, along with several twisted pieces of wire. Holmes retrieved them with care. There it is again, he murmured. Wire embedded in feather shafts, modified quills, messages concealed within the body of a bird, and then burned, though not thoroughly enough. A soft knock interrupted our examination. Lestrade entered, followed by a woman of about 60, sharp-eyed, upright, and dressed in severe black with a mourning veil. This is Miss Abigail Fenner, Lestrade said. She's come from the Museum of Natural History. Says she worked with Professor Ellery some years ago. The woman inclined her head to Holmes. I do hope I'm not interrupting. When I read of Horace's death, I felt I must come forward. I may have information of interest. Holmes gestured to the armchair. Please, Miss Fenner. We welcome any illumination. I worked with Horace at the museum between '86 and '88, she began. He was brilliant, if eccentric. But a year ago, he wrote to me unexpectedly, asking if I still kept my catalog of seabird migrations. He said he needed to compare flight paths across continental Europe. He was vague, but hinted that the pattern had returned. I thought it curious, since he mentioned Bremen. Holmes leaned forward. And did he mention anyone by name? Associates, collaborators. He signed his letter, yours, in signal and silence, which I thought poetic at the time. But now, she paused. He spoke of a Dr. King, a German researcher he'd met at a conference in Bern. I don't believe he trusted the man. Holmes folded his arms. You've been most helpful, Miss Fenner. If you recall anything further especially about this Dr. King, please contact me at once. She departed shortly thereafter, and Lestrade followed with her, offering a perfunctory nod. Holmes turned back to the hearth. "Watson," he said quietly, "this is no longer a local murder. Bremen burn. Feathers as vessels of communication. The death of Professor Ellery may have been a silencing act to stop knowledge from reaching others. And Jarvis?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Is the next intended victim, if he is not already more deeply entangled than he admits." He reached into the grate and held up the scorched wire with his tweezers. "A feather once held a key," he said. "Now it may unlock something far larger." Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects that afternoon found us once again at Baker Street, our study filled with the golden half-light of the declining sun. Holmes sat cross-legged upon the settee, a sheaf of notes spread around him in a semicircle, each marked with meticulous annotations in his precise, angular hand. I had taken the liberty of organizing the names and statements we had gathered thus far. The late Professor Horace Ellery, his assistant, Mr. Edmund Jarvis, the sharp-minded Miss Abigail Fenner, and the mysterious Dr. Kingig. One name stood out, unconnected, yet ominously recurrent: Bremen. Holmes's violin lay idle by the fireplace, untouched. His mind was fixed upon the living web of motivations and appearances that had begun to stretch across our investigation. "We must understand the men who surrounded Ellery," Holmes said at last, his voice quiet but decisive. "Not just those we know, but those who stayed in the shadows. If the professor was involved in passing coded messages through ornithological studies, it would require a network, perhaps even a society." "You suspect espionage," I said, leaning forward. "I suspect design," Holmes corrected. "Whether political or personal remains to be seen, but I intend to examine each figure in the late professor's orbit." He rose, crossed to the sideboard, and pulled out a thin folder. Inside was a list obtained earlier from Lestrade, the names of individuals who had either corresponded with or visited Ellery in the month before his death. Among them were a publisher, 2 naturalists, a university benefactor, and a name I had not expected: Lady Frances Bellingham. "The philanthropist?" I asked. "I've seen her name associated with zoological funding." "Indeed," Holmes said. "And she has a known interest in migratory birds. Donated a significant sum to the South Kensington Aviary Trust. But it is her private correspondence with Ellery that interests me most." "How did you come by that?" I asked. Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. "Lestrade is not the only man with connections in the postal registry. We called upon Lady Frances that very evening, her grand home on Belgrave Square, glittering with gaslight and the faint scent of orchids. She received us in a parlor of green velvet and gold trim, flanked by a harpsichord and several rare mounted bird specimens, eagles, cranes, and, curiously, a single white stork poised mid-strike." Holmes bowed. "Lady Frances, thank you for seeing us on such short notice." "You are quite welcome," she said, waving us toward a pair of wing-back chairs. "I suspected you might come." Poor Horace. I hardly believed it when I read the news. "You knew him well?" Holmes asked. "I funded one of his earlier expeditions to the Baltic marshlands. He had an extraordinary mind for patterns and an irritating tendency to vanish without warning." "Did he ever speak of threats or dangers?" Holmes asked. Lady Frances raised a single, elegant brow. He once mentioned that his research might become politically inconvenient. I assumed it was hyperbole. Scientists are prone to dramatics, Mr. Holmes. But he also asked me some months ago to refrain from forwarding a package he expected from Prussia. He said he would collect it personally. Did it arrive? Holmes asked. It did. I have it still unopened, as instructed. Holmes and I exchanged a look. Would you permit me to examine it? He asked. She nodded, rose, and returned with a slim box, wrapped in plain brown paper. The address was indeed scrawled in Ellery's hand. Holmes examined it closely, but did not yet break the seal. Did you know a Dr. Koenig? He asked. Her lips tightened. No, but Horace mentioned him once. A specialist in avian neurology, I believe. There was a falling out, though I never heard the details. As we took our leave, Holmes pocketed the package, promising to return it if it proved irrelevant. On our journey back through the misty streets, Holmes was unusually silent. The cab rocked steadily beneath us as he ran his fingers along the edges of the unopened parcel. Watson, he said at length, a woman of Lady Frances's standing does not keep a package on her property unless she believes it has value. She knew we would ask for it. I believe she was waiting. Do you suspect her? I asked. I suspect everyone until the logic eliminates them, Holmes said. And in this case, logic points toward shared knowledge among our suspects. Back at Baker Street, Holmes delicately unwrapped the parcel. Inside was a narrow wooden box, lined in dark velvet. Within it lay a single glass vial, sealed with wax, and a folded letter in German. Holmes handed the letter to me. Translate, if you please, Watson. I read aloud. For the final phase of testing, the white morph must be isolated. Signal dispatch begins at lunar midpoint. Confirmation by feathered cipher. Destroy all traces. Kink. Good heavens, I said. This sounds more like a code than a scientific message. It is both, Holmes said, and it confirms much. King is involved. The signals are active, and the feather is their cipher of choice. Whatever this white morph is central to their plot. Just then, a knock came at the door. It was Inspector Lestrade, his expression grave. We've had a break-in, he announced, at the boarding house where Jarvis was staying. Holmes stiffened. Is he harmed? No. He left for a late meal at a tavern, but when he returned, his room had been ransacked. Nothing taken but a single item was placed on his pillow. Lestrade held up a small envelope. Inside, carefully preserved, was a goose feather this time, dyed black at the tip. Holmes stared at it for several seconds before speaking. The circle tightens, he murmured, and the birds begin to flock. Chapter 5. The black-tipped featheret was nearing midnight when Lestrade departed, the black-tipped feather sealed in an evidence pouch, and the door of Baker Street once more closed to the fogged streets outside. Holmes did not sit, nor did he speak immediately. Instead, he paced the length of the room in even strides, the silence broken only by the soft tick of the mantel clock and the rustle of papers disturbed by the draft. I, for my part, was seated by the fire, watching the shadow of my friend pass and repass like a pendulum. This escalation is no coincidence, Watson, he said at last. The intruder left no real damage, no theft, no ransacking worth the name, but he did leave a feather, as a warning. Holmes stopped abruptly and looked at me. No, as an invitation to what? To the next move in a game he believes he controls. I considered that carefully. You think the black tip has significance? Color always has significance when chosen deliberately. White is purity, absence perhaps innocence. Black, in contrast, denotes closure, warning, even death. Whoever left this feather meant to declare a shift. The message has changed. He returned to his desk, drew out a fresh sheet of paper, and began listing the feather variations thus far. The hollowed goose quill in the lock, the burned feathers in Ellery's hearth, the feather on Jarvis's windowsill, and now this one blackened at the tip and placed atop a pillow. "Watson," he said, tapping his pencil thoughtfully, "there is something ritualistic here. Not in the sense of superstition, but in the performance of a sequence, a choreography of thread. These actions are too deliberate for common intimidation." I stood and joined him. "But if the intent is not to frighten, what then?" "To communicate," Holmes replied. "To those who know the symbols." A silence followed, broken only when Holmes looked down at the sealed vial from King's package. "I shall examine this first thing in the morning at Bart's. Until then, there is one more figure I wish to visit tonight, at this hour." I asked. Holmes gave a rare, thin smile. The minds that think by night are often the ones with something to hide. By 12:30, we stood before a narrow townhouse in Clockenwell, its facade plain but well kept. Holmes rapped twice, sharply, upon the brass knocker. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a man in his 50s, with sharp, angular features and a dark robe fastened at the throat. His eyes flicked over us with a practiced wariness. "Mr. Malcolm Erskine?" Holmes asked. The man hesitated. "Who's asking?" "Sherlock Holmes. I believe you corresponded with Professor Ellery several exchanges in the last month regarding avian territory disputes." Erskine blinked, then slowly stepped aside. "Come in, but be brief." We entered a study, redolent with pipe smoke and paper walls, lined with journals, taxidermy, and copperplate maps. Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Erskine, do you know of a cipher known as the Bremen Code?" The man's eyes narrowed. "You'd best explain your purpose, Mr. Holmes." Holmes did not blink. "Professor Ellery was murdered. I have reason to believe he was involved in the transmission of encoded data hidden in scientific correspondence, possibly through bird migration records. I believe you were part of that circle." Erskine stared at him, face unreadable. "You're chasing ghosts." "Then indulge me," Holmes said softly. "What did Ellery fear?" For a long moment, Erskine stood still. Then he moved to a small drawer and removed a folded envelope. Inside was a letter. "He sent this 2 weeks ago," Erskine said. "Said he'd uncovered a recurrence, something hidden beneath. The migratory shifts of the white stork populations along the Baltic line," said the data, mirrored a pattern he'd seen during the war-coded courier movements, masked as birding expeditions. "From whom?" I asked. "From German agents," Erskine replied. "During the 70s Franco-Prussian conflict, certain factions used ornithologists to carry messages across borders. Markings on tagged birds. Seemingly innocent." Holmes leaned forward. "And now, there's talk," Erskine said quietly, "of something rising against some network rebuilding itself. Bremen is a hub. The name Kig is whispered. Why did Ellery come to you?" "We shared an interest in cross-channel migration," he said carefully. "But also he knew I kept records. Records from 20 years ago. He wanted comparisons." "Did you give them?" Holmes asked. Erskine nodded slowly. and now I regret it." Holmes took the envelope gently and tucked it into his coat. "I believe," he said, "that your regret may yet be warranted." We returned to Baker Street, well past 2 o'clock. Holmes sat before the fire, eyes half-lidded, but mind visibly worried. I, too restless to retire, prepared a pot of coffee. "Erskine gave you more than data," I said. "He confirmed something I long suspected," Holmes replied, "that this is not merely a puzzle of feathers and dead men. It is a structure, one constructed in the shadows, built upon the assumption that birds are harmless and science innocent, and the feathers are the ink of a language we've not yet fully deciphered." He stood and went to the window, staring into the night where a single gull circled high above the gas lamps. "Someone is trying to revive an old system of secrets, and they are willing to kill to keep it hidden." He turned back to me, face solemn. "We must move swiftly, Watson, before the next feather falls." Chapter 6. A hidden inconsistency. The following morning broke clear and cold, with a thin veil of mist clinging stubbornly to the cobbles along Baker Street. Holmes, already attired in his traveling coat and gloves, stood at the window, gazing out through the frosted pane. I had barely rubbed the sleep from my eyes when he turned to me, the same glint in his expression I had come to associate with revelation. "There's a contradiction, Watson," he said. I stifled a yawn and reached for the coffee pot. "A contradiction in what?" "In Professor Ellery's behavior," Holmes replied, "and in what we've been told about it." I lowered my cup. "Go on." "According to Mr. Jarvis," Holmes began, pacing, "Ellery had grown increasingly paranoid in his final days, locking doors, burning papers, mistrusting even the post. He refused to let others handle certain communications and began sleeping in his study for safety. All behavior consistent with a man who feared surveillance or intrusion." I nodded. "Yes, and reasonably so. If he suspected espionage." "Yet," Holmes said, halting, "he chose to leave a message on the desk the night of his death. It comes with wings, but an incomplete sentence," I offered. "Or a deliberate clue," Holmes said. "And here is the inconsistency. If he feared discovery so greatly, why leave behind anything at all?" I frowned. "Perhaps he intended to finish it before he was interrupted. Then why write it at the desk, in plain view? Why not conceal it more securely, as he had with the telegram in the ornithology book? No, Watson, there's something off in this act. It's performative, and performances, especially when staged in death, are rarely authored by the victim." A coldness prickled my skin. "You mean to say," "I mean to say," Holmes cut in, "that it is entirely possible someone else placed the note there after Ellery had already expired." He swept toward the table and picked up the sheet where he had copied the desk message. "A dying man's penmanship falters. The original note, as you saw, was crisp, unshaken, which either suggests Ellery was perfectly calm moments before dying, or that someone else wrote those words to throw us off the scent." I stared at the copy, its short message now taking on a more sinister tone. "What would such a message intend?" I asked. Holmes's brow furrowed. "Wings suggest birds. But the phrase 'comes with wings' could apply to any messenger, any instrument of travel or delivery. The unfinished clause is a masterstroke of ambiguity." There came then a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson admitted a young boy, Billy Wiggins, one of Holmes's irregulars. He clutched his cap in both hands. "Message for you, Mr. Holmes. From Dr. Harrington at Bart's." Holmes took the envelope, broke the seal, and read swiftly. Then his eyes narrowed. "Excellent. The vial we obtained from Lady Francis's package contains a derivative of digitalis poison?" I asked. "In high doses, yes," Holmes replied. "In small amounts, it alters pulse and mental clarity. The Germans used it during the previous conflict to blur memories and induce suggestibility." "And you believe Ellery was drugged?" "I believe," Holmes said slowly, "he may have been administered it over time. A gradual weakening of the mind, turning his fears into certainty and his reason into obsession." I stood. "Then someone close to him was dosing him." "Precisely," Holmes said. "And now we must revisit the one person who had unfettered access to the professor's person and possessions, his assistant, Mr. Edmund Jarvis." We found Jarvis waiting in the tea room of the Northumberland Hotel, hands clasped tightly around a half-finished cup of tea. He looked up as we entered, and the sight of Holmes brought a flicker of apprehension to his otherwise placid face. "I was expecting you," he said, voice low. "More news than—" "Of a sort," Holmes replied, taking a seat. "You told us, Mr. Jarvis, that Ellery grew increasingly paranoid." "Yes, sir." "And that he destroyed papers and spoke of being watched." "Yes. You also mentioned he burned feathers in the fireplace." "That's right." Holmes's gaze grew sharp. "Why didn't you mention the fainting episode he suffered the week before his death?" Jarvis's mouth opened, then closed again. I didn't think it relevant." "But you were there," Holmes pressed. "You helped him to the divan in the parlor. And when he came to, he couldn't recall what day it was. Is that not correct?" Jarvis hesitated, then nodded. "He said it was just exhaustion." Holmes leaned in. "And yet, I've spoken with the apothecary in Wandsworth. He delivered tinctures to Ashcroft House at your request. They were harmless," Jarvis insisted. "Just herbs to help him sleep." Holmes's voice hardened. "You requested a digitalis compound under your own name." Jarvis turned pale. "I didn't mean to harm him," he said, suddenly unsteady. "He was always anxious, I thought. If he rested more, he'd stop seeing enemies in the shadows." "And yet," Holmes said coldly, "the dosage was increased over time. Enough to affect his judgment. Enough to muddle his thoughts." Jarvis said nothing. I spoke gently. "Mr. Jarvis, did you administer the poison yourself?" "No," he whispered. "It came in the tea blend. From a parcel he received weeks ago. He said it was from King. I prepared it, yes, but I didn't know what was in it." "I swear." Holmes studied him. "Then I suggest you remain exactly where you are. For your safety and for ours." He rose, turning to me. "We have what we need, Watson. The contradiction is resolved. Ellery's deterioration was not natural. It was nurtured, grown carefully." I followed him into the cold street. "You believe, Jarvis?" "I believe he's a pawn. The real hand behind the dosing is caged now, more than ever. I want to know what this white morph truly is." He looked up, and a pale gull wheeled once overhead before disappearing into the sky. "The next move belongs to me." Chapter 7. The silence of wings. The following day was marked by a brooding stillness over London, as though the city itself were waiting for something unseen to alight upon its rooftops. A fog rolled in from the river just after dawn, cloaking the streets in a spectral haze that dampened every footfall. Holmes was up before me, already scribbling on the back of a telegram form when I entered the sitting room with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Sending for someone?" I asked, handing him his cup. "Not someone," he said without looking up. "Something." He scrawled a final line, folded the form, and sealed it in an envelope addressed to Miss Abigail Fenner at the Museum of Natural History. She may yet hold key to a question that has troubled me since the day we stood in Ellery's study, Holmes said. "And what question is that?" Holmes took a sip of coffee before answering. "Why birds?" I blinked. Surely that is self-evident. Ellery was an ornithologist. Indeed, Holmes agreed, but espionage does not cling to professions arbitrarily. Why not entomology or marine biology? Birds, migratory birds, in particular, have the unique ability to traverse vast regions unimpeded by borders. I now suspect that the feathered cipher is more than a message. It is a map. "A map," I echoed. "A symbolic one. Not of terrain, but of intention," he replied. "We must see Miss Fenner again." At once, Miss Abigail Fenner greeted us beneath the high-arched entrance of the museum's west wing, her expression composed yet alert. She wore the same severe attire as before, and her dark eyes studied Holmes as one might a specimen under glass. "You said it was urgent," she remarked as she led us down a narrow corridor flanked with taxidermy birds' hawks, warblers, thrushes all frozen mid-movement. Holmes walked slowly, glancing at the placards. "Miss Fenner, you once mentioned Ellery's fascination with storks, particularly the white morph variant common along the Baltic migratory line. Do you recall whether he linked their roots to anything unusual?" Fenner hesitated, stopping before a display of migrating waterfowl. He was obsessed with deviations, irregular changes in direction. He tracked one flock across eastern Prussia and noted that its path curved southward against expectation toward a coastal inlet near Bremen. Holmes turned sharply. He noted it publicly. "No," she replied. "Only in a private letter." He said it reminded him of a wartime maneuver, though he didn't elaborate. He called it the inversion drift. I dismissed it as metaphor. Holmes's eyes lit with something approaching reverence. "Metaphor is the mask of science's deeper truths, Miss Fenner. I believe the inversion drift was a signal." Watson and I looked at him. "Think, Watson," he said. "If you wished to relay a location without writing coordinates, how would you do it? You could reference a migratory pattern, one only certain observers would understand. A shift in avian behavior could mark a rendezvous point, a corridor of transport, or a trap." Miss Fenner's eyes widened slightly. "Are you saying birds are being used not just to carry messages, but to point the way?" Holmes gave a tight nod. "A flock veers where it should not. A rare morph appears where it never has before. And those who know how to read the signs follow." "Follow to what?" I asked. "That," Holmes replied, "is the very heart of this affair." Upon returning to Baker Street, Holmes summoned Billy Wiggins once again and gave him a note with precise instructions to deliver a wire to Bremen, addressed to an old acquaintance in the German postal authorities, someone Holmes had once aided in a forgery scandal. He paced restlessly once the boy had gone. "We are running out of time, Watson. Whatever this signal is, it has either already gone out or soon will." I turned to him. "You think there will be another death?" he paused. If Ellery's death was the silencing of a conscience, then the next may be the erasure of a witness or the activation of an agent. Just then, the bell rang. Mrs. Hudson returned moments later with a telegram. Holmes took it, unfolded the paper, and scanned the message. Received. White morph, sighted at Coastal Post 14. Pattern confirmed. Transmission loop complete. E-Post 14. Holmes murmured. That is the inlet Fenner described. The loop is complete, which means the message was sent. We are behind, but sent to whom? I asked. Holmes looked toward the fire, his expression tight with thought. To someone still in London. A long silence fell between us before Holmes turned sharply. Jarvis must be moved tonight, not just for safety, but because he may not be a pawn at all. I stared. You suspect him again? I suspect everyone, Holmes replied, but Jarvis in particular troubles me. He knew too much about the professor's routine, intercepted his tea, and yet has conveniently avoided all serious harm despite 2 warnings. What if the feathers were not warnings, but signals? You mean markers? I asked slowly. Precisely, Holmes said. A black-tipped feather does not warn, it confirms. That evening, as a low wind stirred the window panes and the fog deepened, Holmes and I rode by cab to the Northumberland Hotel. But when we arrived at Jarvis's room, it was empty. The bed was unmade, the windows closed, and the teacup on the desk still warm. On the nightstand lay a feather. It was not black-tipped, it was white pure, slender, and unmarred. Holmes picked it up carefully with his handkerchief. He's gone, he said, and this isn't a farewell. It's an arrival. I felt the air in the room shift. You mean he's not the next victim? I said slowly. He's the one waiting for someone else. Holmes's face darkened. Or something else, he said. And for a moment, there was only silence in the room, save for the soft rustle of the feather in his hand. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. It was nearing midnight when Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. The fog outside thickening with each hour until the gas lamps blurred into pale ghosts of themselves. Holmes said nothing as we ascended the stairs. He removed his coat with mechanical precision, his brow drawn, eyes flickering with the storm of deduction that raged silently behind them. Watson, he said at last, prepare yourself. Tomorrow we begin forcing hands. I sat by the fire, watching him pace. You believe Jarvis was never the target? Holmes halted. No, he was part of the engine, possibly the courier, perhaps the final interpreter. But that white feather was not a warning left for him. It was a signal left by him, a message to someone watching that the passage is complete, and the next phase can proceed. He crossed to his desk and began rifling through old cases, pulling out maps, notations, and one yellowed paper marked the Valland telegram cipher. 1875. What are you looking for? I asked. A framework, he muttered. If we understand the logic behind the cipher's structure, we can anticipate the next move. And what do you intend to do about Jarvis? Holmes tapped the map. If he's the agent, he will seek contact. If he's merely the vessel, someone will come to him. Either way, I intend to catch that fish by disturbing the surface. The next morning was bitterly cold, the city wind biting through scarf and coat alike. Holmes had risen early and arranged for a decoy letter to be delivered to Lady Frances Bellingham, one that I was not allowed to read but which, Holmes assured me, would reveal far more than it concealed. She has remained peripheral, Holmes said, as we waited near the gates of the South Kensington Aviary Trust, and yet every path bends subtly in her direction. She funded Ellery. She stored the coded vial. She withheld the parcel until we asked, and she has neither denied nor confirmed any relationship with Dr. Kinnig. And you believe she will respond to the bait? I asked. She must, he said. The message implies that Kingi has returned to England under a false name. I blinked. Has he? No, Holmes said simply. But she cannot afford to ignore the possibility. By noon, our trap had its first tremor. A carriage pulled up outside Lady Frances's Belgrave residence, and a man in a dove-gray overcoat emerged, a tall figure with a pronounced limp and a thick scarf obscuring most of his face. Holmes and I observed from across the street through the frosted window of a borrowed bookshop. Too deliberate, Holmes murmured. The limp is feigned. See how he forgets it. Do you believe that's Kaig? Holmes didn't answer. Let us find out. We made our approach an hour later. Holmes handed his card to the footman and waited patiently in the marbled entrance hall. When the butler returned, his tone was apologetic but firm. Her ladyship is indisposed, Mr. Holmes. She regrets. I'm afraid I must insist, Holmes said coolly. Kindly inform her that if I do not speak to her within the hour, I shall forward the name she is now protecting directly to the Home Office. The butler blanched, then disappeared up the stairs. We were ushered in moments later. Lady Frances sat by the window, her expression unreadable. The man from earlier, now conspicuously absent. She gestured to the chairs with the formality of someone conceding ground they cannot hold. Mr. Holmes, she said, you are persistent. And you, Holmes replied, are carefully aligned with every turn of this case. She folded her hands. You speak in riddles. I helped Professor Ellery because I believed in his work. Holmes stepped forward. Then you should have told us you corresponded with Dr. Heinrich King directly. You funded his Baltic expeditions under the name Aristarchus Society, and you continued to receive his dispatches even after he was condemned for illegal scientific experimentation in 1889. Lady Frances said nothing for a long time. Then, what do you think is happening here, Mr. Holmes? I believe, Holmes said, that a message network built during wartime is being revived under the guise of scientific study. I believe Keg is not merely a biologist, but a tactician, one who uses migration, morphs, and deviation patterns to coordinate something vast. I believe Ellery tried to break from it, and you tried to protect him until he slipped. Slipped, she asked. He began seeing ghosts in birds, warnings in the wind, Holmes said. But what he feared was not madness. It was exposure. She rose then, slowly. Her voice, when it came, was quieter. You are correct about much of it. King's methods went beyond what I condoned. I funded him for scientific progress, not for subterfuge. But when I tried to cut ties, he threatened to expose the very system we had helped design. And Jarvis? I asked. He was placed by Kinnig. I only discovered it too late. I warned Horace, but he wouldn't listen. He believed he could outplay Koenig at his own game. Holmes's voice was clipped, but he lost. Lady Frances did not flinch. He died, yes, but not from poison. That, I promise you. The digitalis was his own. He took it to remain focused. He told me so himself. Holmes tilted his head. Then who placed the feather in the keyhole? Her silence was answer enough. König, I said. I never saw him, she murmured. Only his agents. They leave no tracenly feathers. Holmes stared at her for a long moment. I will find him, he said. I hope you do, she whispered, because the next feather may be placed at Parliament. We returned to Baker Street under a leaden sky. Holmes had barely removed his gloves before the door burst open and Lestrade appeared, breathless. There's been a break-in at the Natural History Museum, he said. Fenner's office. Holmes went still. What was taken? A single drawer from her research cabinet. One labeled White Morph Delta Line Entries. I looked to Holmes. He turned to me, very quiet. It's begun, Watson, he said. The birds are no longer just flying, they're landing. Chapter 9. A second attempt. Casting golden halos in the fog as Holmes and I raced through the streets toward the Museum of Natural History. The cab rocked on the slick stones, but Holmes, seated rigidly at my side, showed no concern for the jostling. His eyes were fixed on some invisible point in the distance, and I recognized that look, a mind working faster than the world around it. The White Morph files, he said abruptly. If King removed them, it's not to conceal but to act. You believe the theft was strategic? Without doubt, Holmes replied. Delta line entries, tracking irregular movements. If we interpret the morph patterns as a code, those records may serve as coordinates. For what? I asked, leaning forward as we rounded the museum gates. Holmes's voice dropped low. A rendezvous, a transfer, or worsen, attack. We were admitted quickly, thanks to Lestrade's presence and the urgency of the matter. The east wing of the museum was dim and hollow, its exhibits looming in the dark like silent sentinels. Miss Fenner stood by the shattered display case outside her private study, her expression tight with restrained fury. It was precise, she said as we approached. They took only that drawer, ignored the silver, the instruments, the other specimen files. The case was pried open with a tool, not smashed. No glass shards. No alarm triggered. Holmes crouched beside the display. No forceful entry at the main doors. None, Lestrade confirmed. We think they gained access through the side service hatchingly. Someone with knowledge of the building would have used it. Holmes straightened. Then we are dealing with someone who has been here before. Miss Fenner crossed her arms. The Delta Line entries detailed deviations in flight from the Norwegian coast to inland Germany. Ellery was obsessed with a set of storks that diverged from the others. He said their shift was unnatural, too sharp, too sudden. Were these deviations consistent? Holmes asked. Fenner nodded. Yes, each year a pattern emerged. The birds touched down in unmarked, isolated locations, always along the same latitude. Ellery mapped them but refused to show me the final chart. Holmes turned. Then he hit it. He paced the room, examining walls, bookshelves, floor tiles. Then, with a sudden motion, he moved to the cabinet beneath the taxidermied golden eagle. He ran his hand behind the base, feeling along the wood, then smiled faintly. Here, with a gentle tug, he removed a slim rolled chart hidden in the panel. He unrolled it on the table, revealing a map of Europe. Thin red lines crisscrossed through it, arcing like wings across the continent. A set of dots marked certain towns and fields. but one was circled in ink. A small coastal village labeled Dunharrow, Pointan, the eastern Kentish coast. This is the convergence point, Holmes said. Everything, messages, signals, agents sit, all aligns here. Fenner stared. But that village is nothing, just fishermen, cottages, and a weather station. Holmes tapped the map. Then something in Dunharrow is not what it seems. Just then, one of the museum attendants came rushing in. Miss Fenner, there's been an incident at your boarding house. Holmes turned at once. What incident? They found someone in the alley behind it. A man. We arrived at the boarding house within the hour. The crowd had already gathered, and Lestrade quickly cleared the way. A constable stood over the crumpled form of a man, a thin trail of blood running from his temple. As we drew closer, I recognized him at once. Jarvis, I exclaimed. Holmes knelt beside the man. Still alive, he muttered. Breathing shallow, pulse weak. We helped carry him inside, laying him upon a couch as I administered what aid I could. It was clear he'd been struck with force, likely from behind. Holmes stood over him, hands clasped behind his back. This, he said quietly, was not to kill. It was to prevent him from arriving somewhere, I asked. Or to stop him from delivering a message, Holmes replied. Lestrade frowned. Are we still sure he's working against us? We are sure, Holmes said, that he knows far more than he's told. He turned to me. Watson, when Jarvis wakes, stay with him. Press gently. He may now be disoriented enough to speak without calculation. And you, Holmes's voice grew steel cold. I go to Dunharrow. By the next morning, Holmes was gone, having taken the first train to the Kentish coast. I remained with Jarvis at the boarding house, his forehead now bandaged and his breathing more regular. It was well past noon when his eyes fluttered open. Mr. Jarvis, I said gently, you've had a frightful injury. You were attacked. His gaze was clouded, but a flicker of recognition crossed it. Remember a man. He wore gloves. He said something. What did he say? Jarvis closed his eyes. He said, the flock moves without you. Then everything went black. I leaned closer. Jarvis, were you supposed to meet someone in Dunharrow? He turned away, but a single word escaped his lips. Yes, who? A pause. Then, faintly, not who. What? I stared at him. Jarvis whispered, barely audible. He called it the Heron Vault. And with that, he slipped once more into unconsciousness. Back at Baker Street that evening, I paced restlessly, awaiting news from Holmes. When a telegram finally arrived, it bore only a single line. They have been nesting in plain sight. Tonight, we disturb the roost. She looked toward the window, the fog rolling back in. The second attempt had failed, but Holmes had taken flight. Wind off the Kentish coast was sharp and salt-laced as Sherlock Holmes stepped off the morning train at Dunharrow station. The platform was deserted, save for a single porter dozing on a bench beneath the timetables and the distant cry of gulls circling above the dunes. Holmes paused only long enough to glance at his surroundings before striding toward the edge of the village. His coat snapping in the breeze like the wing beats of a seabird, he carried with him the map Ellery had hidden. The red lines of migration and coded coordinates folded neatly in his coat pocket. Each step he took brought him closer to the location marked most boldly, a patch of coastal land just beyond the village, limits blank on most maps. but now burning with significance. The walk took him through winding lanes and whitewashed cottages. Dunharrow was a quiet hamlet, its thatched roofs and flower boxes deceptively benign. Fishermen unloaded crates of silver-scaled catch, while elderly women swept doorsteps. Yet there was something too still about it all, too rehearsed. Holmes's eyes caught the details. The single window shutter, always drawn at number 7. The dog that barked at no one. The postman who made his rounds with military precision. At the edge of the village stood a low, weathered structure, an abandoned watchtower from the Napoleonic era, now overgrown with ivy and listing with age. This, according to Ellery's chart, was the heart of the mystery. Holmes approached the crumbling tower cautiously, scanning the area. No visible footprints in the wet grass, no smoke, yet something tickled the edge of his awareness. Scent of oil, faint, industrial. Wrong for the countryside. He circled the base and found a rusted iron door. It creaked open under the pressure of his gloved hand, revealing a short staircase leading downward. The air grew colder as he descended. He lit a small lantern he had brought with him, and was immediately struck by the precision of the space. Beneath the watchtower, carved into the stone like a forgotten cellar, lay a vault. Not a vault in the traditional sense, but a long, narrow corridor of meticulously reinforced walls, lined with racks and drawers. Some contained scrolls, others metal canisters, feathered samples, or boxers marked in German script. This, Holmes realized, was no ordinary hideaway. This was the Heron Vault. Back in London, I remained at Jarvis's bedside, watching as the man drifted in and out of consciousness. Though his words were fragmented, one detail had emerged repeatedly in his delirium. A phrase, "The wings fold at dusk." What did it mean? I had little time to ponder it. By mid-afternoon, Lestrade arrived, bearing a telegram from Holmes, forwarded through the Kentish signal station. Heron Vault located. Contents intact. Rendezvous expected by nightfall. Request reinforcements by dusk. Do not engage until I signal with green flare. Lestrade read the message twice. He's alone. For now, I said, but not for long. Holmes moved through the vault with growing certainty. Here was everything Ellery had suspected. Feathered quills rigged with copper wire. Ink files laced with trace sedatives. Charts of bird movements, meticulously overlaid with troop schedules, weather maps, and rail timetables. The Heron Vault was not merely a hiding place. It was a command center. In the far wall stood a panel bearing a heron etched into its face. Holmes examined it closely. A small circular slot beneath the carving matched the circumference of the reinforced feather shaft he had taken from Ashcroft House. He withdrew the feather from his inner pocket, slid it into the opening. A click, the wall released with a hiss of pressure. Beyond it lay a chamber sparse, but unmistakably inhabited. A single chair, a ledger open on the desk, and a map upon the wall marked with the words Delta Activation, Phase 2. Holmes moved to the ledger. The most recent entry was dated only a day prior. Phase 1 confirmed. Jarvis delivered trigger at Ellery's site. Secondary key placed at museum. Awaiting inland confirmation for deployment. He closed the book. A sound from above made him freeze gravel shifting. They were coming. Meanwhile, I boarded the next express to Kent with Lestrade and 2 armed constables. Holmes's instructions were precise. Arrive at dusk. Remain out of sight. Wait for the signal. When we arrived at Dunharrow, the village was still and oddly deserted. Shops shuttered early. Not a single boat remained at the dock. It was as though the villagers had quietly retreated, whether out of fear or loyalty. We could not yet tell. We made our way silently to the old watchtower and took up position in the thicket of reeds overlooking it. I peered through my field glass and spotted faint movement, a group of men descending the slope toward the entrance. One limped. Another had a gloved hand. Holmes's guess had been correct. Among them, unmistakably now, was King. Inside the vault, Holmes extinguished his lantern and waited in the shadows. The first figure to enter did so with practiced caution, checking corners, signaling the others. Kinge came last. Older now than in the photo Holmes had obtained, but just as sharp. His voice was soft, guttural. "It is ready," he said to the others. "Retrieve the ledger. We erase the nest tonight." But as Kig reached for the desk drawer, Holmes struck. A single flare arced from below, green and brilliant, bursting in the sky above the WATCHTOWER dot outside. I saw it and rose at once. "Now," I shouted. The confrontation in the vault was swift and violent. Kingage turned, striking blindly with a baton, but Holmes sidestepped. The other men scattered, but the narrow corridor worked in Holmes's favor. By the time Lestrade and his men burst through the entrance, Koenig was on the floor, his accomplices disarmed or fleeing into the marsh. Koenig hissed from between his teeth as Holmes knelt over him. "You do not understand. This is only a relay." Holmes looked down at him, but now, he said coldly, "Your wings are clipped." And outside, as the wind rose, the roost fell silent. Chapter 11. The true motive surfaces the following morning. Holmes and I sat aboard the early London-bound train, its engine churning steadily through the fog-kissed countryside. Keg sat shackled in the guard's compartment, flanked by 2 armed constables. Lestrade had remained in Dunharrow with a small team to continue cataloging the Heron Vault, which Holmes insisted must be preserved in its entirety for Whitehall's scrutiny. I said little during the first hour of the journey, my mind still turning over the implications of what we had uncovered. Holmes, for his part, sat across from me in silence, his fingertips pressed together and his gaze fixed not on the passing scenery, but somewhere deep within his labyrinthine thoughts. Finally, I ventured, "We stopped them, but I cannot shake the feeling, Holmes, that we've only just begun to understand the meaning of it all." "You are correct, Watson," he replied, his voice low. "King's capture was necessary, but his network, what remains of it, is rooted in something far deeper than coded migration or poisoned ink." He reached into his coat and removed a folded document. I retrieved this from the inner panel of the ledger drawer, hidden beneath the pages. I unfolded the paper carefully. It was a fragment of correspondence, written in German and partially water-stained. Holmes translated aloud to the Society. "Phase 2 must not be delayed. The experiments have revealed the importance of the delta line. Observation confirms the correlation between deviation frequency and human behavioral response. The birds are not merely carriers, they are the test." I stared. "The test?" Holmes nodded slowly. "It changes the entire complexion of the affair. Ellery believed they were using birds as messengers. That was true to a point. But Kaig had other ambitions. He was not merely coordinating agents. He was studying patterns, human and avian. You mean? Behavior modification. Precisely, Holmes said. The sedatives, the feather codes, the shifts in migration, they were all part of a grander mechanism. King's Delta Line was not a route, it was a pressure point, a psychological circuit. He sat forward, voice now clipped with conviction. Jarvis was part of a larger experiment. So, I suspect, was Ellery. I blinked. But Ellery was intelligent. Holmes, he sensed something was wrong. Holmes's gaze was solemn, and that is why he was eliminated. By noon, we were back at Baker Street. The lamplight cast familiar shadows on the walls, and Mrs. Hudson brought in hot tea with a sigh of relief. "You'll be pleased to know," she said, "that young Mr. Jarvis came round fully. He left a note for you. Mr. Holmes said he'd speak plainly now." Holmes took the slip, read it once, and handed it to me. It said simply, "I'm ready. I'll come to you, midnight." "EJ, he'll be watched," Holmes murmured. "But we'll let him come." The rest of the day was spent in analysis. Holmes spread the vault's recovered contents across his desk maps, ledgers, tagged feathers, and half-deciphered codebooks. He moved between them with restless energy, often pausing to pin red-threaded markers to a large canvas he'd erected beside the fireplace. When evening fell, the web of connections grew dense. London, Bremen, Bern, Dunharrow, and, curiously, a final Pinchatham dockyard. "Another port?" I asked. "An interception point," Holmes said. It was the end of the Delta Line before King shifted the convergence. And, if my suspicions are correct, it was also the original test site. He held up a photograph, grainy, likely taken in secret, of a small weather station beside a cliff. "I found this among the coded messages. Kung visited it regularly." "But why?" I asked. "It's remote." "That's precisely why," Holmes replied. "Somewhere isolated enough for controlled study. I believe the experiment began there, an attempt to influence the perception of pattern and instinct." I frowned. "You mean?" "They used birds not to carry messages, but to affect how people saw things." "Precisely," Holmes said, tapping the photograph. "The repetition of feather deliveries, the echo of winged symbols, the gradual erosion of rational certainty in men like Ellery. This is not merely espionage. It is psychological conditioning." There was a long silence. "Then the true motive was not military," I said, "but intellectual." Holmes gave a grim smile. "The purest danger of all, Watson, those who believe the world is a lab, and its people variables." At exactly midnight, Jarvis arrived. He stood on our doorstep like a man who had aged a decade, hat in hand and collar pulled high against the wind. We let him in without ceremony. Holmes gestured him to the fire. "You've had ample opportunity to disappear," Holmes said. "Why didn't you?" Jarvis sat stiffly. "Because the more I see what's been uncovered, the more I realize what I was complicit in. I thought I was part of something noble," Kig said. "We were studying migratory cognition. Nothing more. Ellery was to be the control." "But he resisted," Holmes said. Jarvis nodded. "He stopped responding as expected, began questioning things. Keg said it would compromise the results. I was told to monitor him. The feather, the one I left on the sill, was meant to mark the beginning of the data transfer. I didn't know what would follow. You delivered the vial as well, I said. Yes, he whispered, though I didn't know its contents. Holmes leaned forward, and now Jarvis looked into the fire. Now I know I was the experiment too. Holmes was silent a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me about the Heron Vault. How many knew?" "Only Koenig, myself, and one other. A woman, codename Valediction. I never saw her face." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "The name chilled me, I believe," Holmes said. "We've already met her." When Jarvis had gone, Holmes remained at the window for some time, staring into the night beyond the street lamps. "The true motive," he said softly, "was not secrecy. It was control, to shape action through unseen influence. The feathers, the birds, they were never just symbols. They were tools, vectors, and somewhere, Watson, ... someone is still watching the skies." And the firelight flickered, dancing like wings. Chapter 12. The Betha next morning dawned gray and still. The kind of London day where even the chimneys seemed too weary to release smoke. Yet there was tension in the air, tension I could feel even in the soft clink of Holmes's spoon against his teacup as we sat at breakfast. He had slept little, if at all. His eyes were shadowed but sharp, and a quiet resolve had settled over him. "The net is nearly closed," he said, without lifting his gaze from the telegram he was reading. "But we are missing one strand, the last player." "Valediction," I said. He nodded. "King's handler, or perhaps his equal. A figure neither Jarvis nor Lady Francis has seen clearly, and yet her influence lingers at every step. She set this experiment in motion, Watson. She has seen it nearly to completion, and if I am correct, she will not allow it to end so quietly." I looked up. "You mean she strike again?" "I believe she already has," Holmes said. "Last night, while you slept, I received word from Lestrade. One of the packages recovered from the Heron Vault has gone missing en route to Whitehall. The guard was found unconscious, a feather tucked into his lapel." I stared. "Then someone still has access, even after King's arrest." Holmes stood abruptly. "That package contained Ellery's final field notes, the very ones he refused to mail. Valediction wants them not destroyed, but deciphered, which tells me two things. One, she is still looking for something hidden in those notes, and two, she believes we may possess a copy." He walked to the mantelpiece and removed a folded sheaf of papers. "In fact, we do. Fenner gave me duplicate scattered jottings from Ellery's private observations. Harmless enough at first glance, but a pattern reveals itself when viewed through Koenig's cipher key." He spread the pages across the table, connecting lines with a pencil until a phrase emerged between the bird tracking data. "One voice, one sky, one fall." "It's poetic," I said slowly. "But what does it mean?" Holmes shook his head. "A rallying cry, perhaps, or a signal embedded in language. Either way, it is something she would kill to retrieve." I folded my arms. "Then you mean to offer it to her?" He gave me a tight, approving glance. "Precisely. If she believes we have what she needs, she will come to us. And this time, Watson, she will not have the shadow to hide in by afternoon." Holmes had already dispatched 3 telegrams, one to Lestrade, instructing him to station plainclothes officers at 3 points around Baker Street. One to the director of the museum, asking for a coded notice to be placed in the scientific communities bulletin board announcing a private reading of Ellery's unpublished work. And the third, to Miss Fenner. She will not miss that, Holmes said. If valediction is within our web, she'll come to retrieve the bait. And where shall the bait be presented? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. Here, at precisely 7 o'clock that evening, our sitting room was prepared, as if for a scholarly consultation. The hearth was lit, the tea set laid, and the desk covered in manuscripts. The map from Ellery's vault was partially unrolled, the message left deliberately visible. I sat near the corner with a revolver tucked beneath a ledger. Lestrade and his men watched from opposite buildings, signaled to act only at Holmes's mark a flick of the curtains. Holmes stood by the fire, hands behind his back, eyes never still. We waited, and then came the knock. 3 soft raps, deliberate, spaced, like a metronome. I reached for the revolver. Holmes stepped forward, composed. "Come," he called. The door opened and in stepped Lady Frances Bellingham. I froze. Holmes did not. She removed her gloves slowly, her gaze cool and unblinking. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I understand you have something I might find enlightening." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, a series of notes belonging to the late Professor Ellery, though you led us to believe your involvement ended with King. Most telling." She did not sit. "I never denied that I had interests of my own, but you mistake me if you think I come to threaten. I come to ... negotiate." Holmes gestured to the desk. "Then negotiate. But you should know the room is not as empty as it appears." Her lips curled faintly. "You forget, Mr. Holmes, I taught King the pattern of birds." That was the moment it clicked into place for me. "You're not his partner," I whispered. "You were his teacher." Holmes's voice turned cold. "You are valediction." She inclined her head without shame. "A name for a farewell, Mr. Holmes, and I assure you, we are just beginning." At that moment, Holmes gave the slightest twitch of the curtain. Outside, Lestrade moved. Lady Frances saw it. Her expression never changed, but her hand moved swiftly inside her coat. Holmes stepped forward, intercepting her arm with one smooth motion. "I think that's quite enough." A commotion erupted as Lestrade burst through the door, followed by 2 plainclothes men. They quickly subdued her, though she offered no resistance. Holmes turned to me as they bound her wrists. She needed to see if we had decoded Ellery's message. That phrase, "one voice, one sky, one fall," was her signature. A phrase meant only for those within the circle, but it also incriminates her. It ties her to every point of contact. Lady Frances was silent as she was led away, but as she passed me, she paused. "You think this ends with me?" she asked softly. "Look to the skies, Doctor. The birds still fly." Then she was gone. Later that night, as Holmes sat again at the fire, I asked, "Do you believe her?" He stirred his tea. "In part. The wings may have been clipped, but I suspect there are still feathers we've yet to see." He looked toward the window, where a nightbird called once and vanished into the dark. "And we must be ready, Watson," he said, "for the moment they return." Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape it was 2 nights after Lady Frances Valediction was taken into custody, and Baker Street, though quieter, did not feel settled. The wind had changed. Holmes noticed it first. A nervous edge hung over London, like mist along the Thames. No newspapers reported her arrest. No official statement came from Scotland Yard. It was as if the entire affair had been wrapped in silence, sealed away as neatly as King's cell. And yet, Holmes grew restless. She was to calm Watson, he said as he paced before the fire. A woman who knows the game is over does not warn her enemies. She pleads, bargains, or grows bitter. But Lady Frances was composed because she believes something remains in motion. I set down the evening paper. You think she planned for her own capture. I think she planned beyond it. At that moment, a knock sounded at the door, hurried and unsteady. Mrs. Hudson admitted Inspector Lestrade, breathless and damp with fog. She's gone, he said at once. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Lady Frances. Lestrade nodded grimly. Escaped from the holding cell at Aldgate. No sign of forced entry. 2 officers drugged. We found only a message. He handed Holmes a folded square of parchment. Holmes opened it, and we both leaned closer. Drawn in black ink, simple and unmistakable, was the outline of a heron in flight. Beneath it, a single line, where feathers fall, silence follows. Holmes's jaw tensed. She was never caged, only waiting for the roost to scatter. Lestrade looked uncomfortable. We've locked every port, signaled across the coast, but if she's still in London, she's invisible. She's not invisible, Holmes said quietly. She's already left a shadow. He turned to me, his voice now calm and clinical. Jarvis, do you think he's involved again? I asked. I think he never stopped being involved, Holmes replied. Lady Frances was the strategist, Coog the executor. But Jarvis, he was the message that walked by early morning. We were once again at the Northumberland Hotel. Jarvis's room was empty. A single white feather lay on the window sill, placed, not dropped. Holmes examined the room. The bed was undisturbed, the desk untouched, but the waste bin held remnants of burned parchment. He sifted through the ash gently until he pulled out a fragment of card. Faded writing remained, but one word stood out: Chatham. He straightened. It's the port where Koenig operated, I asked. And where the final relay was scheduled, Holmes replied. It's the last logical site. If she's fleeing, she'll do it from there. Lestrade leaned in. We'll need authorization to coordinate with the Naval Office. Holmes shook his head. No time. If they go to ground again, we lose them. Watson and I will take the early train. Meet us there with reinforcements. The journey to Chatham was cold and silent. Holmes spent the ride reviewing Koenig's chart fragments, piecing together the unmarked routes along the coast. I could see the tension coiling in him, not anxiety, but a calculated energy, drawn tight like a string before release. We arrived just past noon. The port was alive with activity, smoke curling from naval chimneys, gulls shrieking overhead, steam rising from moored barges. Holmes led us through the alleys behind the dry docks until we reached a narrow warehouse with no signage, only a rusted heron weathervane. Above the gable, he motioned for silence and slipped through the side entrance. I followed. Inside was shadow and silence. Dust hung in the shafts of light, and crates lined the far walls, forgotten shipping containers. But in the center stood Jarvis. He turned at the sound of our approach, startled but not unprepared. You shouldn't be here, he said quietly. Holmes advanced a single step. Neither should you. Jarvis held his hands out, almost pleading. She said it was for balance. One last act, and the chain ends. No more experiments. No more feathers. You were to release something, Holmes said. A message. A final movement. Jarvis hesitated. It's not what you think. Holmes stepped closer. Then what is it? At that moment, from the shadows, behind a stack of crates, another figure emerged. It was Lady Frances, unarmed, composed, and smiling. I said farewell, Mr. Holmes, she said, but the birds do not always fly as one intends. She held something in her hand, a folded chart, inked and weather-worn. Holmes didn't move. The final coordinates. They are meaningless to you, she said. They are for those still listening. Those beyond this shore. You'll never reach them, Holmes said. No, she replied, but the wings already have. Lestrade and his men burst through the back doors. At that moment, weapons raised. Lady Frances did not resist. She turned toward the crates, looked skyward through a crack in the ceiling, and said simply, "They will find their way." That evening, back in Baker Street, Holmes sat by the window with a single feather on the table beside him. It was white, unmarked, perfectly still. She was never trying to win, Watson, he said softly, only to send the message. And do you believe it was received? Holmes stared out at the dim London sky, where a gull passed silently above. Somewhere, he said, a bird has landed, and someone is watching. And so the wings folded. For now, Chapter 14, Holmes closes in the final clue. Revealed it was well past midnight when Holmes finally rose from his chair and approached the desk. The white feather still lay there, untouched since our return from Chatham. For hours, Holmes had sat with it in silence, as though waiting for it to speak. The fire had burned low, and outside, the city had surrendered to sleep, but inside 221B Baker Street, the atmosphere was taut with unfinished deduction. Watson, Holmes said at last, not turning. We have been chasing the flock, but what we must now examine is the perch. The perch, I echoed, startled out of my drowsiness. The structure, Holmes clarified, tapping the feather with a gloved finger. The system in which all of this was built. Kenya's network was elaborate. Yes, but not insular. Lady Frances did not just send messages. She shaped how they were read. She understood not only how to deliver deception, but how to embed it in ritual. He moved to the shelves and retrieved the original copies of Ellery's personal notes. Those coded observations that had first revealed the phrase "one voice," "one sky," "one fall." Ritual, Holmes repeated, is the language of obedience. Ellery was being conditioned to follow patterns he no longer controlled. The feather in the keyhole, the black-tipped quill, the white morph deviations, all of it symbolic. But what if the final symbol has been in front of us all along? He unrolled Ellery's original field map, again well-worn, smudged with soot from our time in the Heron Vault. Holmes drew a small compass and ruler from the drawer, then aligned them with the three most frequent points on the Delta line: Bremen, Bern, and Dunharrow. When he drew connecting lines between them, I leaned in. A triangle. More than that, Holmes murmured. An orientation. Look here. He rotated the paper. These lines do not intersect by accident. Ellery believed he was tracking birds. In reality, he was tracking arrival point stages of communication, yes, but also behavioral saturation. Each point marked a shift in allegiance. In decision-making, he jabbed the point where all lines met. Here, the actual heart of the pattern. I bent closer. It was a small, coastal outpost, a disused semaphore station near Dover. Eastgate Bluff, I read aloud. I've never heard of it. You're not meant to, Holmes said. It's not a formal port. It was decommissioned decades ago. But it appears repeatedly in King's notes, always in the margins, always under aliases. He stood, his face suddenly alight with certainty. That's where it ends, Watson. Not with messages sent, but with messages received. Everything, every act of symbolism, every feather, every pattern was structured to lead us away from the receivers. Then what happens at Eastgate Bluff? I asked. Holmes turned to me, his voice low. Something is arriving. By early morning, Holmes had telegraphed Lestrade and secured a private carriage south. We rode through the Kent countryside under a shifting gray sky, the land increasingly desolate as we neared the sea. A cold wind picked up across the cliffs as we arrived at Eastgate Bluffer, crumbling stone building atop the headland. Its windows broken, its flagpole long splintered, but as Holmes stepped from the carriage, he froze. Below us, half camouflaged against the rocks, lay a moored skiff modern with no identifying flag. A receiver, Holmes murmured. Not military, not civilian, independent. We made our approach in silence, climbing down a narrow path until we reached the bluff's rear entrance. The building was hollow and dark inside, but not abandoned. A faint glow pulsed from within lamplight. Holmes signaled for caution. We entered a long, decaying chamber once, a signal room. Shelves of rusted equipment now served as storage for crates and field gear. A pair of lanterns illuminated a desk strewn with documents in multiple languages, bird migration data, sea charts, and intercepted communications. But what caught Holmes's attention was a glass cylinder atop the desk. Inside it, suspended in a vacuum chamber, was a single feather, black-tipped, marked with faint silver etchings. Along the spine, microscopic writing. Holmes stared. She sent this, he said quietly, not as a message, as proof. I stepped closer. Proof of what? That the system works, Holmes said. Even after King's fall, even after her capture, she knew someone would come. Not us, but them. Suddenly, from behind the crates, a man appeared, slight pale, wearing a dark oilskin coat and holding a revolver. You were not meant to find this place, he said in heavily accented English. Holmes did not flinch. But you expected someone to. I expected an ally, the man said, not a relic. Holmes stepped forward. This is the final phase, isn't it? The delivery complete, the experiment successful. All that remains is transmission. The man's eyes narrowed. Too late now. They already know. The wing has passed. Just then, Lestrade and two constables entered behind us, revolvers raised. The man froze. Step away from the desk, Lestrade barked. The figure hesitated, then dropped the weapon. Holmes exhaled slowly. That was the final attempt. Not to kill, not to flee, but to release. He pointed to the feather. It is the last cipher. The culmination of King's theory, not data but signal structure. The code embedded in that quill is a seed. Plant it in the right hands, and the system restarts. Lestrade moved to seize the cylinder, but Holmes raised a hand. Not here. Not in the open. He turned to me. Watson, tell me plainly what falls faster than a feather. I blinked. A stone. Holmes nodded. Then let us bury this one deep. Back in Baker Street that night, Holmes wrote a single line in his case journal. The wing has passed, but not forgotten. Let silence be the last messenger. Then he closed the book, turned down the lamp, and sat back in his chair, eyes on the dark window. Outside, the sky held no birds, and that, perhaps, was the greatest piece of all. Chapter 15. The final gathering. It was 2 days later, and Baker Street had settled into a strange, quiet one that felt more like anticipation than rest. Outside, the February mist had returned, curling like breath around the chimneys and dulling the clatter of hooves along the street. Within, Holmes stood by the window, arms folded behind his back, eyes distant. We had not spoken much since the return from Eastgate Bluff. Cylinder containing the final featherets etched cipher lines, still uncatalogued, had been delivered under armed escort to a secure vault within the Admiralty, accompanied by both Lestrade and a cipher expert from the Foreign Office. As Holmes had predicted, it had never appeared in the public record. It was a loose end not meant for public understanding. But Holmes was not finished. "This is not yet resolved, Watson," he said that morning, his voice level. "The network has been severed, yes, but not unraveled. What we dismantled was an active branch, not the root. You suspect another faction. I suspect others already suspect each other," he said. He turned from the window and retrieved a folded notice from the mantelpiece. This came yesterday, an invitation, rather unexpected. I read the header: Royal Ornithological Society, Special Session on Avian Cognition and Behavioral Symbolism. "And who extended it?" I asked. "Miss Fenner," Holmes replied. "She's convening a private panel, composed of the remaining figures linked to Ellery's fieldwork, Jarvis among them. And interestingly, Ineflady Francis's estate representative has confirmed attendance." I blinked. "But she's in custody." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Is she? We haven't been informed of her sentencing, nor has the Home Office issued a statement. My instinct says she has not only bargained, but been permitted to maneuver." "You think she'll be there?" I asked. "I think she'll want to see what becomes of her creation." That afternoon, we arrived at the Society's hollow, narrow Georgian building, tucked along a row of identical facades in St. James's. Inside, the lecture chamber was intimate, almost austere. Tall windows were veiled by thick curtains. A long oval table stood at the center, around which a small company had already gathered. There was Miss Abigail Fenner, dignified and precise; Edmund Jarvis, pale and visibly uncomfortable in a collar far too stiff for his disposition; and Dr. Malcolm Erskine, the grizzled researcher whose earlier reluctance had given way to quiet vigilance. A few minor figures from the academic community murmured quietly at the edges of the room, and then she entered. Lady Francis, no guards, no chains. She wore black velvet trimmed in ivory, a mourning brooch pinned at her collar, and not the faintest trace of uncertainty in her posture. If she was surprised to see Holmes, she did not show it. "Mr. Holmes," she said calmly, still watching the skies. "I never stopped," he replied, "though it seems others were more interested in the ground beneath them." The gathering came to order with Miss Fenner taking the chair. She announced the session as a private memorial an analysis of Professor Horace Ellery's final contributions. But it was clear the subtext ran deeper. Holmes remained silent through the first half-hour, letting others speak about bird intelligence, migration anomalies, even the role of myth in scientific communication. Jarvis gave a short statement about Ellery's dedication to precision. Dr. Erskine mumbled about distortions in funding. Lady Frances merely nodded at each speaker, her hands clasped in her lap, and then Holmes rose. He did not pace. He did not gesture. He simply spoke. "There are certain languages that do not rely on grammar," he said. "Languages of color, of motion, of presence and absence. The feather, for example, is a poor messenger for ink, but a perfect one for silence." The room grew still. Holmes's voice lowered. "You built a structure, Lady Frances. One not of wires or towers, but of expectation. You taught men to see meaning where none existed. Then let that meaning grow year by year into obedience. Keg implemented it. Ellery resisted it. Jarvis was caught inside it." He turned slowly toward the room. "And now we must decide what to do with the residue of that structure. Because the feathers have stopped falling, but the minds they shaped do not forget." Lady Frances met his gaze. "I have no power left," she said quietly. "But your legacy does," Holmes replied. "And unless we expose every rung of the ladder you built, someone else will climb it." Miss Fenner spoke then. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Holmes?" "I propose," he said, "that this society preserve every detail of the Heron Vault not as research, but as warning. Let it become part of the scientific record, not a mystery, not a myth, a failure, one we must never repeat." Jarvis lowered his head. Lady Frances said nothing. After a pause, Miss Fenner nodded. "Then it is resolved." The session ended quietly, without ceremony, but I knew, as did Holmes, that the final feather had just been laid that evening. We returned once more to Baker Street. Holmes poured 2 glasses of brandy and passed one to me. For the first time in days, his shoulders eased. "You believe it's over now?" I asked. "For now," he said. "But science is a patient tool, Watson, as are those who misuse it." He raised his glass. "Who saw too much Hun too clearly?" And for once, I did not respond with a word, only silence, like the wings of something vast, just out of sight. Chapter 16. Holmes' final reflection. It was a week after the Society's quiet vote, and the storm, it seemed, had finally passed. The remnants of King's apparatus had been archived under lock and key at the Royal Archives. Its mechanisms studied and, by formal recommendation, restricted from future application. The Heron Vault was officially sealed. Its maps, vials, and ciphered feathers preserved not as tools of scientific progress, but as cautionary relics. And Lady Frances Bellingham, having surrendered her influence in exchange for silence, had retreated from public life altogether. The newspapers spoke only vaguely of a misguided continental experiment in migratory confusion, a euphemism fit for forgetting. But Holmes had not forgotten. That morning, I found him on the rooftop of 221B Baker Street, wrapped in his dressing gown, eyes turned skyward. He held a brass spyglass in one hand and a sheaf of papers in the other. "Watching for feathers?" I asked as I stepped beside him. "Watching for patterns," he said quietly. "It begins again when the world stops believing it could." He passed me the pages. A simple correspondence from the ornithological outpost at Northumbria. One of the junior researchers, unaware of the broader case, had recorded a recent shift in the nesting behavior of certain black herons. Not migration, but formation. The birds had begun building their nests in a peculiar spiral configuration, uniform and precise, despite being separated by hundreds of miles. I lowered the papers slowly. Coincidence? Perhaps, Holmes replied, but in the hands of men like King, coincidence becomes instruction, and in the hands of those like Lady Frances, it becomes scripture. We descended from the rooftop, and Holmes returned to his violin. He played for an hour without speaking up. When he stopped, he placed the instrument aside and turned toward me. "You remember what she said?" he asked. Valediction, her last words before they took her from Chatham. "Where feathers fall, silence follows." "I believe it now," Holmes said. Not as threat, but as philosophy. She wanted to build a system so elegant, so seamless, that no orders would need to be spoken. The feather would fall, and men would obey without question. I sat beside the fire, and we stopped it. He smiled faintly. "Yes, Watson." This time, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes took it without hesitation. He read it once, then twice, then he passed it to me. Observed identical feather structure in North African stork colony. Marked spine. No known tagging agency involved. Should we proceed? D.H. Cairo Ornithological Survey. Looked up, startled. Another signal. Holmes rose slowly and walked to the window. Or an echo. Perhaps someone else, elsewhere, has uncovered the same architecture and is attempting to speak in its tongue. Then it hasn't ended, I said. Holmes turned back toward me, his expression unreadable, yet not grim. "No, Watson. It has only gone quiet." We sat together for some time in that reflective hush, the clock ticking gently in the corner, and the city murmuring beyond our windows. I knew Holmes would not pursue this new signal, not yet. He had laid the feathers to rest once, and for now. The roost was still, but I also knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that he would watch the skies, always, and if ever again the feather fell, so too would Holmes rise.